Okay, I think we can begin. We're still expecting a couple of people from their previous class. Hi, everyone. Good evening, everyone in Moscow, and then good morning, everyone in the United States. It was a fascinating semester, I think, for this class, for both MGIMO and Fletcher students. It was a definitely fascinating experience for me. As someone was sitting in for Professor Istolman in this class. Very interesting and fruitful discussions with our students. I covered a lot of ground, and it was a very interesting semester, of course, because we had to switch in from online, offline modes in teaching here at MGIMO. But it was also a very interesting time in US-Russia relations, and which I think is interesting that we're having this event pretty much the next day after the first meeting between the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the State Secretary Anthony Blinken. The meeting in Moscow, the coverage, the reactions that we're getting is pretty good. The overall meeting is assessed as productive, and it's interesting that for the first time, the press releases in both the State Department and the Foreign Ministry did not mention words like interference and cyber attacks, which was a pleasant surprise for the Russians, of course. But on the other hand, it was a while since they last mentioned Syria and conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That was interesting to see in the State Department press release. Most importantly, perhaps, there were 4 areas singled out in the American after statement: Afghanistan, strategic stability, nuclear deal on Iran, and North Korean nuclear program as an areas for potential cooperation, for sustained and increased cooperation, as the press release said. And the overall tone of the meeting was interesting. With that, however, I think neither party has any illusion that the kind of overall confrontational state of the relationship is there to stay. But this approach where some aspects of the relationship are confrontational, but others are explored for potential cooperation seems to be, if not the new normal, but perhaps modus operandi for some time to come. So with that, we'll look forward to a fruitful discussion today with 2 experts on the American side and 2 experts on the Russian side. And the order we decided to go with Professor Drezner going first, then Professor Igor Istolman, and then Professor Oxana Shevel, and then Andrey Baklitskiy, if that's okay with you. Professor Drezner, someone who does not need introduction for everyone interested in US-Russia relations, a sanctions guru. Very glad to see you, Professor, and with no further ado, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I would add that I assume this is being done in order of increasing knowledge about Russia, so it is appropriate that I go first in that instance. I guess I would say, I'm supposed to keep my remarks short. In terms of thinking about the state of the bilateral relationship, we're more than 100 days into the Biden administration, and it's worth thinking about the fact that so far, at least, Biden represents a deviation from what has been the traditional sort of post-Cold War pattern of incoming presidents, which is, if you look at Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump, they all followed the same pattern, which was coming in, pledging a warming of bilateral ties between the United States and Russia, in some cases declaring a reset, in some cases declaring, other ways in which there could be a fruitful partnership, which was usually followed over the next couple of years by the curdling of those hopes and essentially a reversion of the bilateral relationship to these sort of, I think, passive-aggressive Cold War is the way I would put it, in terms of ties between the 2 countries. That has not been what has happened, I would argue, with the Biden administration's first 100 days, which is there's been a mix. On the one hand, there have been some areas of cooperation. We saw that with the renewal of the New START treaty, and the rather surprising decision by the Biden administration not to imposed sanctions on the Nord Stream gas pipeline this week. And I would add that there's been some enthusiasm in the Biden administration for a bilateral summit with Vladimir Putin. And what's interesting is the degree to which he's articulated that at the same time that you've seen additional sanctions placed on Russian entities for a combination of both cyber attacks as well as human rights abuses. There was at least one crisis, you could argue, in terms of a buildup of Russian forces in Ukraine, not in Ukraine, but near Ukraine, which seemed to have gotten resolved. And of course, relatively hostile rhetoric coming from both sides. I guess the two things I would point out here is that this is in some ways unsurprising because Biden is unique among the post-Cold War presidents as actually having had significant amounts of foreign policy experience coming into the administration. There are not a lot of things in which you can say that Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump have in common, but one of them is that they had almost no foreign policy experience before becoming president. And so it is not surprising that they came in with certain hopes about the bilateral relationship that in the end get dashed. I think it is safe to say Biden has none of those. He seems fully aware of what the state of the bilateral relationship is. And so the good news is that there hasn't been any pumping up of inflated expectations in terms of what the state of the relationship is. And so in that sense, there can't be any sort of fall from those illusions. That's the good news. The bad news, and I would close with this, is that the one area in which I think there's two pieces of bad news. The first is that the preferences of the two countries on a whole array of issues are fundamentally in tension. And the Biden administration has embraced the concept of great power competition that Vladimir Putin embraced close to 15 years ago. And so this is one of these, issues in which they see eye to eye in terms of what the state of the international world is. But the agreement that they have is that they're going to agree to compete. And that means there is going to be plenty of opportunities for friction going forward. The other thing that has changed, however, is the domestic politics within the United States, which is to say you now have both parties in the United States relatively hawkish in terms of their approach to Russia in a way that I think it was not the case even 5 years ago. And I think that's frankly going to persist for quite some time because of a combination of perceived interference in the 2016 election, as well as the more recent question about Russia's role in terms of the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline. Not to argue that the Russian government played a role in that, but rather, let's say, created a permission structure in which that could have happened. And so this is one of those things that I think is actually going to be a growing source of tension over time. So I am legitimately surprised that it didn't come up in the bilateral communique between Blinken and Lavrov that was just issued. But with that, I think I've hit 5 minutes, and so I will be happy to hear what everyone else has to say.
All right, thank you very much. I think we'll reserve the questions to our speakers for after everyone speaks up. So with that, Professor Istomin, you want to make your own mark?
Yes, thank you so much. It's great to be part of this discussion, and it's great to see some people for once again and some new faces. I think Professor Drezner, he put a high bar in terms of presenting a very complicated and uneven situation in such a concise presentation. So I just will try to follow this. Don't know to what extent I will manage to be as up to the point and focused. But I would just follow what he started to think. I think it is indeed a very different pattern in terms of the Russian-American relations, that we do not start with the expectations of some reset. At least with Trump, we didn't have any kind of reset, but we had at least a lot of illusions on the Russian side that this could happen. And now the situation is completely different. I think Biden is perceived as the worst possible kind of person, in many respects, and he has a reputation in Russia as kind of a not very positively inclined towards Russia. But I think what is even more important, that he has, I think, similar reputation in the United States. And to some degree, it makes him a very useful and instrumental person to start some kind of detente with Russia, because unlike the previous leader, it will be very hard, I believe, to criticize him. And by the way, it's on the both sides. The leaders on the both sides are the people who won't be easily criticized as being too soft. It will be very hard to criticize that Biden is too soft on Russia, or that Putin is too soft on the United States. And this creates an opportunity to launch some kind of managed competition, where we will still be in the situation where the two sides will point at each other as opponents, but at the same time, they will be eager to introduce some kind of rules rather than going down the rabbit's hole as it was in previous several years. But there are also some things that I think are very problematic in terms of the Russia-US relations, structurally speaking, so to say. And Professor Drezner already mentioned this idea of great power politics, which I think is indeed one of the kind of contributing factors to the complications in Russia-US relations. But another issue which we have to face, I believe, is also the problem of re-ideologization or ideological polarization, which is growing in international politics. And all this talk about democracy versus autocracy, or liberal values versus traditional values, which became very prominent in the recent years. And although in reality, I think there are much more shades of gray than in this rhetoric. And by the way, this rhetoric, I think, was kind of embraced by the Biden administration as well. It basically puts the world in kind of this polarized state where if you are not with us, then you are against us. And the problem also here is that it's not just the behavior of the other side which is seen as problematic, but the very kind of identity of the other side, which becomes the aspect of competition and kind of a confrontation. So I think this ideological polarization, which is going to stand as far as I see, will also keep on the agenda this issue, which in the last decade, or in the last, it depends for whom, if you look at the Russia, then it's about a decade and a half. If you look at the United States, it's last 5 to 6 years, this issue of foreign interference and the problem of subversion, problem of what the other side is doing in regards to the political system of this side will remain perhaps the most problematic issue in the bilateral relations. And despite the fact that it is not pronounced, as Dr. Suchkov already mentioned in the recent communique, I'm not sure that this problem is going to go away anytime soon. Because basically, on the one hand, we have this ideological polarization, and on the other hand, if you look at internal situation, both societies, both within the American society and within Russian society, we see a lot of sources of domestic discontent, which makes political elites in both countries very much kind of on the defensive and very much concerned about the potential exploitation of these domestic challenges that there exist in both countries. So we have some distinction of roles, and I hope that people who will talk after me will end up on a more kind of optimistic note. I will end here at a more cautionary note. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Mir, you want to add something to it or introduce the second two panelists that we have?
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Suchkov. I'll go straight into introducing our next couple of panelists, and then after that, we can open to a broader discussion. Our next panelist is a professor of political science at Tufts University, Oxana Shevel. Professor Shevel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And Igor, I wish I could say that I will end on a more optimistic note, but I agreed with a lot of things you said, and I don't think I'll have much more optimistic things to say, but I actually want to pick up on some of the things that previous colleagues already mentioned, kind of this broader disagreements, and or maybe we can even think about it as like broader causes of the current very problematic state, obviously, of US-Russia relations. And I think we could even sort of, again, thinking as a social scientist here, it almost seems to me that we are not just talking about sort of your normal great power competition, that countries have different spheres of interest, right, and or want to have different spheres of influence, kind of how it was in the Cold War. I think the situation in US-Russian relations in the last several years, certainly maybe after 2014 events in Ukraine, and potentially maybe even starting sooner than that, I think the disagreements become even deeper because now we have sort of disagreements about basic facts, right? It's not just sort of, what one's interests are, but how one looks at the world, right? Like what is kind of right and wrong, right? At this very, very fundamental level, right? Like say some events we're talking about, say colored revolutions, right? Like obviously there was a very different perspective that the West and Russia had as to what these events are. Are these some manifestations of popular opposition to corrupt dictators, or was this Western meddling in, potentially Russian tradition sphere of influence, right? So it's almost like it became difficult to even discuss basic facts, right? Like the poisoning, right? No, there was no poisoning, right? Like, so it's almost, so it seems to me that, I mean, I take Igor's position. I think this kind of ideology plays an important part in that. But it almost kind of my fear, I guess, would be that there is even sort of, we're even deeper into the rabbit hole, into having like a conversation and having potentially trying to find an agreement, or at least agree on what exactly we are disagreeing and kind of operating within the same reality or the same visions of reality, right? And I kind of fear, and again, I certainly, if other people would kind of like to dispute this, I would be relieved if anything, right? If that's actually not the case, so if this could be somehow like relatively easily overcome. Both sides, I think, have a long list of grievances against each other. And again, oftentimes these grievances come to kind of fundamentally different visions as to what has transpired on the ground, right? Like I think in Russia, probably many would say that the West in general and US in particular has sort of double standards when it comes to Crimea, right? Like Kosovo is often brought into mind, right? I think if you talk to many people in the West, they say that these are really false analogies, that the situation in Kosovo was quite different, and I'm don't have time to go into detail, but again, sort of this, right, like what happened in Crimea, I think we should take it seriously because in that sense, again, from the Western perspective, Russia crossed essentially red lines by annexing neighboring countries' territory, right? In Russia, of course, it is seen very differently, and this issue is not going away, right? So in other words, I think we do have some potentially, again, if we just look at the very immediate situation now, maybe some encouraging signs in the way the Biden administration has, say, dealt with this pipeline, company not being sanctioned. So there are maybe sort of signs, right, or steps that each side can potentially take towards improving bilateral relations. And I'll say a couple of words sort of how I think that might, potentially play out. But I think these bigger issues, right, having to do with sort of fundamentally different ideological visions, fundamentally different understanding of the international world order, right, fundamentally different understanding of almost basic facts, right, and kind of having some way to move forward in that, I think would be, I don't have any answers for this, but I think that's something that is a big important issue. And I think I would be personally very interested to hear what colleagues in Russia and other experts think about kind of making progress on these issues, right? And as far as kind of where can we go from here, again, I think it's a very valid point. I actually didn't think about it before coming here, but the fact that kind of how Biden administration is different, that there was no promise of reset and we're starting from a very low point, right? So in a way, kind of, it almost seems like it would be easier for something to go better because like, how can it really go much worse, right? So that's, I think, is certainly, valid and I think important issue to think about, right? And maybe what we could see, I was sort of thinking like two broad possibilities, right? Like one could be that indeed there could be cooperation on issues that are of mutual importance to the two sides, and where the two sides can agree that, yes, indeed, it's in our interest, right? North Korea, like denuclearization was mentioned, right? Maybe some sort of anti-smuggling, right? I mean, we can think of a lot of issues where sort of contained enough, and each side could say like, yes, we can make some progress there, right? And maybe sort of that sort of like already would be good, right? In other words, in more sort of the small pockets of cooperation we have, right, already the better for bilateral relations, right? But I think if we're thinking about improving kind of state of relations more generally, right, and international sort of decreasing tensions that are created by these, very problematic and confrontational relations between the two superpowers, right? It seems to me like something sort of bigger would have to change. I don't have any specific ideas of what that something might be, but again, if we think back historically, right, the Cold War ended when Gorbachev came to power with very different sets of ideas, right? Yes, of course, there were other kind of most, fundamental changes that took place, and we can say preconditions for perestroika and so forth, right? But again, one possibility could be, in Russia, elections are coming, right? It's unlikely, of course, that, Putin's forces would win, but there are, serious kind of domestic issues in there. And it's not inconceivable that at some point, something sort of domestically fundamentally would change in Russia. That we might see, that may be a window of opportunity, right? In the US, again, right, obviously power changes much more frequently, and there is difference between Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, even within different types of presidents within the same party, right? At the same time, it is much sort of less personalistic political system in that sense, right? We have two parties in the parliament. So kind of, it seems to me, again, I certainly am not saying that everybody has to agree with this, but it seems like as far as kind of these more fundamental global changes, we probably have to look to the Russian side or situation in Russia changing that way, right? So the kind of these two possibilities, or maybe there is, say, like solution to the Donbass conflict somehow, right, in Ukraine. I mean, I think that would be kind of another example of sort of this big change that might shift the state of affairs somewhat. Right, so I guess I would agree with what the speakers before me were saying, right? And certainly I would be interested to think more of what colleagues think, especially experts in Russia, about kind of how to overcome what to me seems this very fundamental, not just ideological, but kind of almost worldview, philosophical disagreement, way of looking at the world and looking at the events in the world that have, to my mind, been very, very different, especially in the recent years between the two sides. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Shevel, for those comments. Our final panelist is Andrey Baklitskiy, a senior research fellow at MGIMO. Andrey.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for organizers for having me. I'm normally dealing with issues of dying or not dying from nuclear war. So it's paradoxical that I'm the person who people look to for some positive outlook. But anyway, in the nuclear sphere, in arms control sphere, call it whatever you call it, things look more simple maybe than they look in other spheres. We are getting to the good old days of not Donald Trump, pretty much every other US administration, which all engaged in some sort of nuclear arms control with Soviet Union and then Russia. So Donald Trump was quite unique in a sense that for the first 3 years of his administration, there was no interest whatsoever. And then in the last half of the year, there was frenzy of activity, which led us nowhere. So we've seen a lot of positive signs, which are basically that it's really not Donald Trump in the White House. China is off the table, at least in the connection with Russia. US is ready to deal with Russia bilaterally, not insisting that China would be a part of it. And also the people who are either appointed or nominated or even rumored to be in the administration all seem to be interested in nuclear arms control, which is a good sign if you want to move anywhere. So I guess we can take for granted that summit is happening, despite Russian constant repeating that Russia is looking into the issue and maybe it's not going to go to the summit. We can probably say the summit is happening sometime around June 15, give or take, in some of the European capitals. So what's going to happen at the summit in my sphere of interest? I don't think that anything specific could happen. There's just not enough time to prepare anything concrete. What I would expect from the summit is that presidents would give instructions to their top arms control diplomats to go to, again, one of the European capitals and to start the discussion, be it strategic stability talks, or again, call it whatever you call it, to start building the ground for any possible negotiations. Again, if you've been paying any attention, you know that we almost ran out of all the arms control agreements. The one last standing is a New START. It will be in place till 2026. It cannot be extended any further. And also we have a whole, assets of problems, starting with, INF treaty is gone, and now it's fair play to deploy intermediate range systems whenever you want, which probably could lead to some, conflicts. And we've seen this happening in the 80s in Europe, for example. We don't have any limitations on missile defenses. We haven't had them in a while, which there again is provoking tensions. Space is unregulated in any way, shape, or form, which means that both countries are really nervous about it. US is nervous because its satellites, which are very important for its military primacy, for its businesses, for everything, are under threat from Russian or possibly some other countries' systems. Russia is very traditionally concerned with US placing weapons in space. So you can see that there is a host of real life problems which you, if you're a sensible statesperson, should address. And it seems that that's what we at least will see. They will attempt to deal with this. So Russia has come up with this idea of strategic equation, which is basically we should not talk only about strategic nuclear forces as we did before, not only the ICBMs and those things which can hit each other directly, but basically from look at this from all the angles, include everything offensive, defensive, conventional, nuclear. If it can perform strategic tasks, then it should be included in this equation. And then we should look at how different parts of the equation impact each other. Once we're done with that, we can start drafting things how to address those issues. It shouldn't be one treaty. It won't be one treaty. That's impossible. But this could be a set of treaties, political agreements, understandings. Again, this is for delegation to decide how they're gonna go on with this. And this looks sort of promising, because we've seen how the sides struggle with, big formal treaties. It takes a lot of time. Sometimes you can then ratify them in your parliaments. So there've been quite a lot of flexibility on the Russian side. And we've seen Russia moving into maybe embracing some of those less formal formats. And of course, as I said, the number of issues to decide are strategic systems, intermediate range systems, ABM, space, maybe non-strategic systems, and so on and so forth. So again, for nuclear issues in general, we are having NPT review conference this summer. So we would probably want for Russia and the United States to produce something, to show something to the world that they are actively engaging on those issues. And then hopefully we will start those long, grueling negotiations when we send delegations and they sit and talk. And this will take, quite a lot of time. Probably not gonna be any huge breakthroughs anytime soon, but that's that's okay. That's how it always have been. One of the issues, again, which looks maybe more on one hand promising, on the other hand threatening if not addressed, is the issue of intermediate range systems in Europe. US is developing intermediate range systems for now to deploy in Asia, but we've heard some of the American military people saying that they would love to see them in Europe as well. So stopping this before it becomes effect on the ground would be really important. So maybe to sum it up, I expect a lot of positivity on arms control front in the upcoming months. The new administration will be putting its people in place. The Undersecretary of State for Arms Control passed her hearings. She will be probably confirmed sometime before the summit. Those people are making, right noises. This looks good from Moscow's point of view. So through the summer into the autumn, this will be like really positive, and people are saying like, wow, how great it is. It's great, this new administration of Donald Trump. Then we'll see how the process goes. We'll see how much political will is on both sides to tackle those issues. We'll see how flexible the parties would be. We'll see how constructive this will go. But you can say that this is a little bit less gloomy than on the other spheres, and I will be happy to, dive deeper if anybody wants me to. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andrey, and to all the panelists for these opening discussions. I'd like to welcome all of the audience members now to put any questions that you have to all the panelists or to any of the panelists into the chat function, and I'll start picking out questions from the audience. But perhaps as people start putting in their first questions, a couple reactions from me. One is how very few tangible points of progress any of the panelists identified. I think there was really only one tangible point on the nuclear or strategic stability front that Andrey wrapped up with, which I think is a striking thing to note. And I guess the second is the sense of if not confusion, at least a lack of clarity as to what U.S. policy will actually be. And in some ways, we have the reverse today of the past couple of years, where under the Trump administration, it was the president who was sort of confused about Russia policy, but the administration had a very clear line in their policy of quote unquote strategic competition, whereas now the Biden administration has a number of different voices, and it remains to be seen which of these voices plays the predominant role on the bilateral relationship and policy towards Europe in general. But I'd like to, before we start grabbing questions from the audience, first see if my colleague, Professor Suchkov, has any reactions, and then after that, perhaps put a couple of questions of my own to our panelists. But Professor Suchkov, over to you.
Sure, thank you very much. I really do have a couple of things I wanted to mention before we turn it over to the Q&A, kind of a few reactions to what our colleagues have mentioned. Well, first, I think the time of resets is gone, and Washington has realized it long before Moscow did. Professor Drezner mentioned that President Biden kind of started off with a new or different approach to Russia, unlike his predecessors. I would perhaps go as far as to suggest that he, in a way, started from a reverse approach by actually kind of escalating a little bit, again, in the eyes of Moscow, by calling President Putin a killer, which of course spurred a lot of negative reaction here in Russia. And then, of course, then the proposal for the summit. Most importantly, I think the way that some assessed the U.S. intent to extend the START treaty was interpreted as that the United States kicked off with this very important and truly important initiative to their security. And by doing so, they kind of postpones the solution of this important issue or extended for over the course of 5 years. But this is the only matter that really is important to the United States or to this administration in its relations with Russia. Everything else that's other things that are going to be discussed and done, if they're going to be done, are kind of in the domain to make Russia less of a problem to the US and really focus on China. I think the paradigm of US-Russia relations of 1990s ended symbolically in Munich with Putin's speech in 2007, and content-wise, even perhaps a little bit before that. The paradigm of the relations of 2000s pretty much ended in 2014 with the takeover of Crimea and the conflict in Ukraine. And what we're actually observing today is kind of another important milestone of how the agenda and the very dynamic in US-Russia relations that have been happening since 2014 are now ending, and we're now kind of in the bifurcation point where we're going to something new. And that something new, there are two things I wanted perhaps to mention. One is that, in my view, Moscow and Washington for now have to focus on a set of issues that they either haven't really discussed in the past or don't have experience in discussing in latest years. My colleague, Andrey Baklitskiy, talked about strategic stability, but I think even that domain is changing in the sense that it no longer is a correlation of qualitative and quantitative offensive and defensive arms, was the case before. But some of the things that are now being developed that impact strategic stability, such as cyber capabilities or militarization of space or new technology in space and sea, that impact strategic stability are not on the table for discussion. And both parties are kind of investing into developing these capabilities, hoping to get advantage of each other. The second, and that of course is, I think, a big challenge and something that both nations have to focus on. And the second point is, I think, to what our other colleague, Oxana Shevel, mentioned about the fundamental philosophical divergence in worldviews, which I totally agree with. Perhaps my own view on this would be there cannot be a marriage of these divergent views, and there should, well, perhaps it should be, but it's not going to happen. And the three ways it may happen, in my view, is A, this worldview of the United States changes, which is unlikely. Despite all the things going in domestic and foreign policy, this American worldview is unlikely to change. The second scenario is the Russian view changes. That is more likely, but perhaps we shouldn't be counting on that because we don't really know. Well, A, when Putin is gone. B, if he's gone, the thinking is going to be changed, or it's going to be, you know, the same thinking. C, a whole bunch of other uncertainties that we can't really forecast. So that's the reason I think we shouldn't be really counting on this. And the third factor is that it appears that neither Moscow and Washington seek to try to marry this divergent worldview, because they're really focused on the solution of pretty technical issues, you know. I mean, technical, but still important, of how to deconflict in Syria and how to make Afghanistan a safer place for everyone, and how to, you know, carry through the JCPOA, and how to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, and how to provide strategic stability. These are all important security issues, but it's not about trying to find common ground on these philosophically divergent worldviews. Yeah, I'll perhaps end here just to give us a little food for thought and trigger the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Suchkov, for those comments. We've got a bunch of questions streaming in, so I'll pick some of them up and toss them to our panelists. First is from Rocky Whites at the Fletcher School, who asks whether we should read the positive atmosphere at the Arctic Summit meeting as an example or as evidence of a new positive atmosphere, or is that just because Arctic meetings generally are more positive than the average US-Russian relations summit? Would any of the panelists like to try to tackle that?
I would just say it's the latter. You know, and again, I would say that what the to the extent that there's a pattern within the Biden administration, it's that they do see that there can be at least a transactional relationship with Russia. And in some ways, this gets at an interesting question I think Igor raised, which is essentially, to what extent does the nature of the ideological competition wind up swallowing everything else? And I do think that at least so far, the Biden administration seems intent on not letting that happen. That while there will be that ideological competition, and I think the Biden administration is clearly willing to participate on that ground, I think they also view it primarily as a rhetorical one and a soft power one, that they don't necessarily want to bleed over into areas where there might actually be legitimately fruitful cooperation.
Let's go with Andrey and then Igor.
Yeah, I would say that we are in a preparation for a summit. So it's, if you want to have a summit, probably you don't need to go full on Russia and do what they did with Chinese in Alaska. So I would say that before the summit, we will also have security councils, heads of security council meeting to prepare the summit. Probably those will be uneventful, and then we'll see how the summit goes.
Yeah, I think Andrey said it all. I think it's just technical thing. It's not. It's indeed. I think in preparation of the summit, first the two sides tried to scare each other very much in April, and now they're at the stage when already they stopped so high, so kind of using these public instruments to acquire some bargaining leverage, and now they're trying to search for the agenda. And I think this is also related to something that I think several already people, and certainly Andrey was speaking partly, the question of the agenda for the summit, because it's obviously the big question is where do we find, even if, because I think there is a genuine interest to somehow put some parts of the confrontation between Russia and the US on hold, but where could we find the agenda to have this positive impact? And very often we are just coming back to one issue on which we can agree, arms control. Actually, a bit earlier today, we had a discussion with EU colleagues from the European Union, and they are a bit jealous about Russian-American relations, because they always say, yeah, you know, with the Americans, it is much easier for Russia always, because you always have arms control. We don't have with this. So indeed, it's a big question. What are the other issues which could be, you know, you don't need just another issue, like you need an issue which could have a multiplying effect, which could provide a broader political resonance. And so far, we couldn't find anything apart from arms control where we could create this kind of resonance. And my concern is that the role of arms control is this kind of positive attitude creating sphere actually diminished in the last years, perhaps because we actually not as afraid of the nuclear war as Andrey said in the very beginning, as it was during the Cold War.
Well, one other audience question we've gotten is on the role of counterterrorism operations, and perhaps we can put the broader Middle East in the same rubric. And I'd be interested in our panelists' views as to whether that ought to be part of the agenda, whether that means Syria or Libya, or any of the other conflict zones in the Middle East. Is there any scope for movement on any of those issues, or an alignment of US and Russian views in a place where there hasn't been that much alignment in recent years? Any comments on that issue? Here.
I think Maxim is the best person to comment on that, as he specializes.
You guessed it. You guessed it.
Wait, can I do this too? Because I'm going to want Chris to answer some questions that are pointed in my direction, just to be clear.
Yeah, well, thank you, Igor. Very generous of you to bring me in this capacity.
Well, I wanted to say just one more point before kind of pointing to you. Just I want to say, terrorism is one of the areas which is traditionally something that I was referring to in answering the previous question, where you could have positive agenda, but it usually doesn't create a multiplying effect. It's kind of, you know, solving one issue without, you know, changing the relations as a whole.
Yeah, well, indeed, we just had a very interesting discussion yesterday with the colleagues from SWP, a leading German policy think tank, and the institution that I think Professor Miller is affiliated with, the Foreign Policy Research Institute with Aaron Stein. And we spoke about the prospects of US, Russia, Turkey kind of cooperation in Syria in particular. And I think our discussion actually exposed that any progress is indeed if it's going to happen, it's likely to be evolving around counterterrorism. And it appears that the United States is going to remain or keep its military presence in Syria and Iraq for at least 2 years, and is likely to refocus more on countering ISIS and kind of clamping down on reemergence of the group. The key problem here, perhaps for Turkey and for Russia to a degree, is U.S. relationship with the SDF. Rumors have it that the U.S. State Department seeks to remove SDF from its list of terrorist organizations. That is unlikely to make Turks angry, and may worry the Russians in the sense that there will be more cooperation between the Kurds and the Americans, which means the Kurds are unlikely to go under the control of Assad, and they will continue to pump oil from the Trans-Euphrates oil fields, which means the Syrian budget is not going to get this money, and it means there'll be more financial and political pressure on Russia. So the details matter here a lot, I think, in terms of how this counterterrorism thing is going to happen, and whether the Syrian government will get to control its border with Iraq, or there will be pockets of American and Kurdish military presence. So this really seems to be hard. And I know there's a lot of skepticism, especially in the Russian military, for whether the U.S.-Russia relationship can go beyond mere deconfliction in Syria, which in my personal view is very unfortunate. And I think there definitely should be a stab at another U.S.-Russia agreement on Syria, but I don't know if it's going to happen. The Blinken-Lavrov meeting brought the mention of Syria, as I mentioned. But it had to do more with the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Idlib province, which is really hard to do because the Russians continue to insist that it's delivered through Damascus, while the Americans are arguing for kind of a broader international engagement in this area. And again, I think there are plenty of dead ends in this discussion, unfortunately.
We got Oksana, please.
Excuse me. I just wanted to make a very quick point. I mean, I am not really an expert on the counterterrorism issue, but to me, like sometimes, like what I just wanted to kind of throw it on the table, that sometimes, even though, as Igor and others said, yes, there could be cooperation on these, say, fighting these certain terrorist organizations, it may not have other positive externalities. But unfortunately, sometimes this whole sort of terrorism term is used in a way that maybe US and Russia may not be on the same page about what exactly counts as terrorist, right? And what therefore would be anti-terrorist. And what I'm thinking about here, more specifically, is this group in Crimea, right? The Hizb ut-Tahrir, that Russia has been essentially rounding up and persecuting a lot of Crimean Tatars on charges that they're members of this quote-unquote terrorist organization, right? That US does not actually consider them terrorist organizations. Again, this is not about the Middle East, but to me, like even sort of on issues such as terrorism, when you can say like, yes, terrorism is bad, everybody can agree about it, we can have cooperation on it, and to some extent it is true. But even on an issue like this, sometimes you can have this sort of different usage of the term, right? That then creates these kinds of disagreements that we talked about, right? And then it could impede cooperation, right? I don't think it applies to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but just kind of broader concept of fighting terrorism does have sometimes this undercurrent. So if
I quickly just can jump in to kind of dwell on what Oksana mentioned. I just spoke a few hours ago with an expert on the US side about this issue, this particular issue. And there are other things in the making that the US seeks to remove Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, from list of terrorist list in a couple of years. And again, it is indeed an extremely different, radically perhaps different approach to which groups get designated as terrorists in US and Russia. Not just, different understanding of what terrorist is and what terrorist groups are, but a very different approach to designating these groups. So basically the US approach to HTS is very kind of in a way technical, that it teared down all the links with Al-Qaeda, or says it did. It kind of no longer seeks to fight the government forces and so on and so forth. So they kind of look at key markers and say, okay, now we think this group is no longer terrorist. Now I can easily understand when that happens and can easily foresee that when that happens, the reaction in Russia will be kind of different in the sense that we say, well, look, Americans removed that list, so that means they're helping these terrorists in Syria and la la la. So, and that's, you know, there you go, another point of confrontation right there.
Andrey?
Yeah, probably not exactly on the terrorism issue, but reacting to something which Igor raised in his remarks. You're right, totally right in the sense that there are some issues which US and Russia would have to engage in one way or the other. One would be arms control. The other probably, as Maxim said, military deconfliction in the places where both militaries operate. And those probably won't have this multiplying effect to solve the relationship and make it better. However, it also depends on what do you want. And others have already, again, mentioned this, that you can find a lot of, you know, places to cooperation, Arctic, climate change, vaccines, you know, development goals, you name it. And a lot of those are high on the Biden administration priority. And if they want to go through the United Nations, Russia would be very important as a permanent member of Security Council. So you have like a lot of places to cooperate on. Probably those won't also have any multiplying effect. But the question is, do we really, like, should we be looking for this multiplying effect? Is this, you know, is there a way really to change the systems in a way that, you know, the relationship would be great again? The last time the relationship were great, when, you know, Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was too weak to have its own opinion on things. Probably Russia wouldn't want that to happen. And before that, I don't even remember when it was the previous time, you know, fighting Nazi Germany, I guess. The question would be, is the situation as it is currently sustainable? Can we just continue living like this? And my guess is yes, if we, you know, solve the issues of, you know, military confrontation, then we probably can continue going as this. The relationship would be bad, but there is nothing prohibitive in having such relationships for quite a long time. And, you know, it seems, at least under this administration, US will be less interested in going out, you know, out overseas and making reality in the way they want it to be and telling other countries how to live. If that's not happening, then, you know, Russia will be much less concerned about the United States. So there are going to be less tensions here. Ukraine is obviously one huge problem, and this will continue biting us. But apart from Ukraine, I don't think there's huge interest in the US to coming Russia's backyard, like in Central Asia or in the Caucasus. The US, you know, has other things to do, at least for now. So I don't know, maybe we can just, you know, continuing like this, maybe less of a confrontational, but pretty much the same course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in on a few things that Andrey said. First, on his last point, I think I would agree with him a little bit, which is to say that if you look at trend lines, it's clear the Biden administration wants to withdraw or at least reduce the US profile in areas that were sensitive, presumably, to Russia, namely, you know, the Middle East to some extent, but also Afghanistan. And one could view those as instances in which it at least works with, it doesn't conflict with Russia's interests. The one area where I don't think that's true beyond Ukraine is just Europe more generally, which is the Trump administration had a horrible relationship with its NATO allies. And the interesting question will be whether the Biden administration is better at building transatlantic cooperation and the way that is viewed by Russia, I presume not terrifically warmly. But the other thing I want to point out is just a quick reaction to something that Andrey said, which is to just challenge everyone's premise for a second. We always assume in these conversations that we would like to see more Russian-American cooperation, and that, you know, confrontation and competition are automatically bad things. And I think in the main, by the way, that's not the worst way of thinking about, or that's not the worst assumption to make. But there are areas you can argue where competition might actually make the world a better place. And I think vaccines are definitely one area where that would be the case. In which, you know, the very fact that Russia has been aggressive in terms of its vaccine exports and in terms of the attempt to use vaccines as an element of its diplomacy, I think has forced the Biden administration to act more quickly than they otherwise would have, to engage in similar kinds of vaccine exports, because they now view this, at least in part, as a soft power competition. And that, for the rest of the world, is a fundamentally good thing. It is something in which you want to see more parts of the world get more access to the vaccine. And so there are areas of prestige competition potentially where the very fact that there isn't a great relationship between Russia and the United States might actually lead to greater sort of positive policy externalities for everyone else.
That's an optimistic view, Professor Drezner. I hope you're right about that. Professor Stillman, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting conversation, and I also could agree with some things that Andrey and Dan already said. And indeed, obviously, we don't want to think about, you know, improving relations just for the sake of, you know, improving relations. You always cooperate for some, you know, frankly speaking, for very egoistic goals, right? We engage in cooperation to get something for ourselves very often, right? But I think, and it's a valid point that was mentioned, that we have kind of some areas where we could see less confrontation, less competition, or less problems than we used to have. And maybe, you know, Afghanistan could be, and Middle East could be such areas. But at the same time, we should also look then at the other areas as well, where we have more competition, more rivalry, and more disagreements than we used to have in the past. And if you go further to the east, from the Middle East and from Central Asia to Asia Pacific, to Indo-Pacific region, we see the other dynamic there. We see a lot of disagreements and rising disagreements there. Not to say that there were a lot of cooperation before, but basically this was just parallel coexistence. And you know, in the last few years, it became a much more kind of controversial area. And not necessarily because of the kind of rational disagreements, but very often because, you know, it's the United States, so we have to disagree with them with any initiative that they propose, even if this initiative in this region, which, you know, maybe we don't have any particular major interest in this regard. But I think, you know, this is that we also have to take into consideration when we look at this situation, not only about the areas where we see less disagreements, but we, I think, need to think as, you know, people outside of the government about the future areas where the disagreements could also emerge. And there are those areas, I'm afraid of.
Are there any questions in the MGIMO classroom from students there? Well, if any emerge, please raise your hand and I'll try to bring you in as well. We got a question about the role of domestic factors in shaping both American and Russian policies. And I think particularly interesting, both after the pandemic as both countries recover. And certainly in the US, Biden has been talking more about domestic policy rather than foreign policy, and about making foreign policy work for the middle class. And economic issues, I think, are also on the rise in terms of their importance in Russia as well. So I'd be interested in the panelists' views on whether domestic constraints or domestic concerns might play a bigger role in shaping either or both countries' policies in the bilateral relationship going forward.
Maybe I'll start just to kind of throw some, since I study domestic politics as a comparativist. I think, I mean, if I were to sort of just, Chris, to your question, which country is more affected? I think at this point, clearly the US, I would say, domestic politics has much more influence, right, on foreign policy. And that's kind of by virtue of being, you know, a country with a competitive domestic political system, with free press, right, with opposition, with independent courts. So by definition, right, like this sort of logic of two-level games, right, that the IR literature has talked about, kind of how events happening at the domestic arena affect what's happening internationally. I think, but I mean, at least to my mind, I think unquestionably, it is the US side that is clearly so affected. And that sort of, I mean, simultaneously, one could say a strength and a weakness, right? I mean, at least maybe if you're looking from the Russian perspective, right? Because US presidents can just do whatever they want. I mean, which, you know, Russian president has much more sort of autonomy, leeway this way, right? But, you know, but on the other hand, it also makes it more difficult. Like if you are, you know, say a foreign power, with Russia or any kind of foreign actor trying to influence what's happening domestically, there are so many centers of influence, right? That it's kind of much more harder to sort of act in this 19th century almost like way, right? That you kind of pressure the right people, right? Or, you know, put, you know, incentivize the right people and sort of get your result, right? The process itself is so unpredictable, which I think is sort of the strength of democracies in some sort of paradoxical ways. I think to many Russians, I'm not saying the experts necessarily, but probably to the general public, this sort of mess, right? Like nobody knows what's going on, right? Like all these procedures, right? Like things take forever. Like how can you get anything done? But it somehow miraculously sort of works out at the end, right? And I think in a way that speaks to one of the questions that was asked, I saw in the chat, about if these events of the January 6th would hand Putin significant propaganda victory to exploit. I think as a soundbite for sure, right? I mean, Russia, we already have a lot of these, you know, that look, US is trying to play this moralizing role, but they have their own set of issues, and who are they? Like, do they have the right to tell us what to do, right? So that's what would play into this same narrative, right? They have, you know, their own share of problems. But of course, if you look at it kind of, you know, more in a more detailed, neutral way as to what actually is happening as a result of this process, right? There is full-scale investigation, there is collection of evidence, right? People have been arrested, people have been charged. This thing is going to play out, right? At the end, sort of the state withstood this shock, might emerge stronger as a result, right? Like this is not the part that we're going to see in the Russian talk shows, right? But again, of course, as far as sort of, you know, did the US fundamentally kind of lost, got weakened, maybe not, right? Like it's sort of now the system, domestic system is going through this, right? So just to end here, I mean, I would be curious to see, you know, what the Russian colleagues or other experts on Russia who kind of know more what's going on there domestically say, like to what extent domestic constraints still play a role in Russia. I mean, we can say maybe elite networks. I mean, I think probably everybody agrees that sort of, you know, kind of broader elite networks in and around Putin, but it's almost like sort of, what is the term? It's like you're trying to kind of guess, like, who, like, nobody really knows. I mean, that's, I get a sense of talking from some colleagues who study Russia. They're saying like lately, you know, lately, but I mean several years, it's very difficult to sort of know like what is actually going on inside the Russian government. What are the decision-making centers, right? Like how these decisions are being made. I think you can say that with regard to the US and kind of Western democracies more generally. It is very messy often, right? But at least you sort of, the process is there, right? In Russia, like, is this up to one person? Is this up to small circle? Is it cooperative ozera? Is it some sort of like broader societal forces, right? Like I get the sense that we don't even really know. So I would certainly be interested to hear like how others see the role of domestic politics influencing Russian foreign policy.
Andrey?
So on domestic constraints, I think it's a oversimplification that Russian government can just do whatever it wants. I mean, it can in a sense, but there are always a price to pay for whatever you're doing, because you still have population, you still have you know, feedback mechanisms, though imperfect, and you still have elections. We have parliamentary elections upcoming this autumn. And if you look at the foreign policy and what role the foreign policy plays in this broader system, I will just give you one example of Russian equivalent of State of the Union addresses. So each year, President addresses the parliament, is describing how the general situation is going on, and often remembered is the 2018 address, which was very militaristic. A big part of it was demonstration of new weapon types and so on and so forth. Like almost a half, I guess, was foreign policy related. And this is actually the least, the one people liked, according to the polls. So foreign policy, military wasn't seen as super, impressive or super interesting. And if you follow the following one, 2019, 2020, and then this year, foreign policy almost disappears from it. It's mostly about well-being, education, culture, youth, what have you. So in a sense, Russian government is attuned to what people want, and it really seems that there is less of an interest in foreign policy, especially in foreign policy which can be called as adventurism. In Syria, Africa, those things don't fall well. So in that sense, I would say there are domestic constraints. And from what I feel, the President Putin, Russian government are quite interested now to have this year going quiet without huge, shocks or anything, because you have elections to hold, you have other business to attend, so that decreases the interest in, active or aggressive foreign policy, I would say.
Any other comments from the panelists? Professor Drezner, I know you wrote a piece yesterday, I believe it was, on what the foreign policy for the middle class slogan that Biden talks about means, but perhaps are there any conclusions from that for U.S.-Russia relations?
No, because Russia doesn't really fit within the sort of, and I've said this multiple times with on panels with MGIMO, so I apologize for those people who have heard this before, but the fundamental problem with the U.S.-Russian relationship is that there is no economic ballast to it. Which is to say that in contrast to the Sino-American relationship, where there is significant amounts of economic interdependence, which again might be contested, might be pushed back, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, that creates interest groups in both countries that have at least some incentive for, not a complete disruption in relations. When you look at the Russian-American relationship, I think Professor Istomin is correct, which is to say that the only sort of sense of mutual interdependence comes from arms control. The degree of bilateral trade or investment between the two simply isn't significant enough to generate the kind of interest group on either side that necessarily has all that much investment in what you would see as potentially warmer ties. And I agree with everything that my colleague Professor Shevel said in terms of the layout of domestic politics in the US, which means it'll fundamentally act as a constraint on too much warming of ties. And I think this is particularly true because the Democratic Party, as I said, used to be viewed as the more dovish party on Russia, and that's no longer going to be the case. But that said, the one advantage of that for the Biden administration is that precisely because the economic ramifications of the bilateral relationship are not all that deep, it also means there's no interest group pressure or constraints on the Biden administration potentially engaging in tactical or transactional cooperation. And so that does give it to some degree some autonomy that might not have existed otherwise. But, no, otherwise.
I'll check once again if there are any questions from the MGIMO classroom. 2 questions, excellent.
So thank you for your speeches, and my question is related to the term sustainable stability and how can the assess it right now. So are we talking about only nuclear sphere, or is it possible also to talk about cybersecurity and other kind of security right now? Thank you.
I also have a question. I would like to say thank you to all the speakers. And my question also refers to the sphere of nuclear strategic stability, but also another element, and one of its elements, the non-proliferation regime. And my question is for Mr. Andrey Baklitskiy, but to also anyone who would like to speak on the topic. So what connection do you see between progress in nuclear arms control and the progress in the nuclear non-proliferation regime? Is this linear dependence or non-linear dependence? And do you believe that unless the US and Russia make some progress in terms of bilateral arms control, there won't be any advancements in the area of solving the problems that the non-proliferation regime is facing right now? Thank you.
Great. So I'll open these questions on arms control and cyber, and perhaps also if their interrelationship up to the panelists. Andrey?
Yeah, I really like it how all the questions from the Russian side are very hard security questions, like arms control, cyber, and non-proliferation. That's very encouraging. The first question about strategic stability and if it will include cyber, it's a great theoretical question. A lot of people are discussing is how can you include cyber in those issues. I remind you that we tried to do this under the Trump administration. There was a special working group created or planned to be created after Helsinki summit, which was planning to deal with information security, cyber, what have you, but it was conceived in total vacuum, because obviously no one would hope that this was going to fly with Americans, and it was never created. And actually we have this the question in the chat about colonial pipeline, and that's an interesting issue. Because apparently this had nothing to do with Russian government. It was ransomware employed by a criminal group. So we might see at least some start of cooperation, coordination on non-governmental cyber threats, which target both Russia and the United States. And maybe from there we can go to something on the state level, though it's much less clear how you can tackle this, because cyber is when we talk about nuclear or strategic things, we talk about hardware mainly, things you can count, things you can see. Cyber is completely different beast, organized in completely different ways, very dual use and dual capable. The entrance to saying in the market is very low, so it's very different from what we're having now, but obviously we'll have to tackle it in some way or form, because it's just growing in destructive capability. I guess since probably no one died from cyber, or at least there's nobody who was definitely could be ascribed to cyber attack, whose death could be ascribed to cyber attack. That's why we sort of take it lightly for now. Once people really start dying, maybe the situation will change and we'll take it more seriously, but that's where we are at the moment. On non-proliferation regime and arms control and how those impact each other, I'm not sure they really do. The majority of countries decide to build nuclear weapons or not build nuclear weapons because it's either in their interest or not in their interest. They don't change their views depending on what Russia and United States do, especially since they've been having those weapons since 40s, 50s. And again, what really can influence, and we've seen what did influence in the past, is when your original rival or someone who's fighting with you for power or primacy gets those kind of weapons, that can trigger you to go for them. As in the nuclear domino theory, of course, it's not absolute. We've seen a lot of cases where there've been no nuclear domino theory, but that's something which does happen. I'm not sure there is a direct correlation between disarmament on US and Russian side and non-proliferation progress or regress.
Comments on either of those issues from any of the other panelists? Yeah.
I guess I would just say two things. First, it would be interesting to see whether the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline will lead to any possible bilateral or multilateral cooperation in terms of cracking down on these kinds of ransomware attacks. I think until now, the general perception of them had been that they were a nuisance, but not necessarily things that would affect national security. And indeed, the whole point of the ransomware attack is that you don't want to bring down the system, because if you do that, then you can't get paid for it. And I think one of the more interesting things is the degree to which even the group that apparently did this didn't realize the ramifications of what they were doing with respect to the attack. So it would be interesting to see whether there is cooperation on this, although it also might be the case that the ransomware actors themselves look at this and think, okay, there are now going to be certain facilities that are just off limits, because even if we attempt to do this, the implications are going to be so wide ranging that we will shine way too large a spotlight on ourselves. And so, there's a weird way in which this could actually be a self-solving problem. I am less confident, though, about the idea of cyber being a nuisance. And indeed, the one concern I have, and I'm happy to have, Andrey correct me on this if I'm wrong, is the degree to which things like the SolarWinds attack or other cyber intrusions could lead either side to believe that you could have a cyber, decapitation strike, in which that in and of itself would create an advantage that, the logic of nuclear deterrence would be undercut. And this is one of those things where I'm somewhat dubious of this logic, but in some ways it doesn't matter whether I'm dubious about this logic. What matters is whether policymakers in either Washington or Moscow think that a strategic advantage could be gained from this. And that is something that would keep me up a little bit at night, perhaps.
Andrey?
Yeah, the worst part about this, is definitely what your leaders think, and you cannot control that, unfortunately. I mean, cyber is very different from, conventional weapons or nuclear weapons or any physical weapons, in the sense that you're never sure that your weapon will work. So if you put something in someone's system, like it can be found tomorrow, in an hour, in a year, and you'll use this capability. So it's hard for you to have this capability and then just, put it there and wait. So you can use this as a deterrent or what have you, because again, once it's found out, it's not a deterrent anymore, it will be fixed. So yeah, it's really unclear how do you even use cyber as a weapon, because it just isn't really good for fighting wars. But yeah, it's just completely different discussion.
Well, we're nearing the end of our allotted time. Perhaps before I wrap up with a final round of questions for the panelists, Professor Suchkov, do you have any reflections or any questions to pose for our panelists?
No, not really. I thought it was a very interesting discussion. I mean, I've find it remarkable that there are some things that both experts on the American and Russian side kind of A, keep in perspective, and B, seem to share these perspectives. So I just enjoyed the discussion and appreciate the engagement by the students and the very interesting questions, and have this hope that in part it was our collaborative effort between the Fletcher and MGIMO and our course that kind of sparked the interest in the students in these questions. Again, I hope that's the case.
Indeed. Well, let me then wrap up with one final round of questions. I'll pose the question to all of our panelists, and the question is this: we're now 1 month away from what appears to be this likely summit between Presidents Putin and Biden. If you could give one recommendation to either of the leaders at the summit, what would you recommend to them to improve the bilateral relationship? Andrey, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I would recommend something which I know which won't happen, and I know reason why it won't happen, but I still would have recommended it. Just restate Reagan.
Worst answer ever. I just want to be clear on that. Keep going.
Just restate Reagan-Gorbachev statement that nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. It would be nice from every possible direction. It will be taken with, taken nicely by the non-nuclear weapon states for the review conference, for a lot of people, but it's probably not going to happen.
Okay, thank you, Andrey. Oksana.
I am not very good at making policy recommendations. That's partly why I am in the discipline that I am in. I really kind of struggle to think like what would be one recommendation, but I guess kind of is more along the lines that I was thinking along in my presentation as well. I think identifying pockets of cooperation and having concrete plan of how to actually achieve something there. I mean, that might be something sort of, again, maybe not just for one summit, but as an overall strategy, right? Because there are, as sort of difficult as relations are, as we talked about here, and, there are some things that the two countries can still see side to side. And I think, if the presidents were to take the lead and say, like, okay, these are the things we see ourselves accomplishing, and then let's get to it, right? Like, and so maybe that could be, maybe not so much strategic, but at least like a technical way to move relationships forward. Not very creative, I know.
Oh, not an easy question, I don't think. Dan?
I guess in this sort of response to some of the tenor of some of the questions I've gotten, I would warn the Biden administration about the dangers of what used to be called neo-functionalism, which was the belief that if you cooperated on, if you developed cooperation on technical matters or sort of what used to be called low politics matters, that would somehow spill over into areas of more substantive possible cooperation. This is an idea that Ernie Haas developed more than 50 years ago. And I think policy with it is something that is sort of a dead concept within the scholarly world, but within policymaking circles is still, I think, often considered, a live strategic option. And I think that would be something that would be dangerous to think, which isn't to deny that there can be areas of cooperation between Russia and the United States, but the hope that those areas of cooperation will then somehow lead to a broader relationship that is more constructive, I think, is naive. And so there's a way in which the Biden administration has approached this, I think, with a more clear-eyed way that, as I said before, doesn't pump up the illusions that will just be dashed later. And so therefore, relative to expectations, there are reasons to be moderately optimistic that the relationship is not going to deteriorate any further.
And finally, Igor.
Well, I think one point, and it's not so much a recommendation, but it was a question that is mentioned somehow in the chat box, and which we didn't raise, was the issue of the, this more technical issue actually of the diplomats and all kind of restrictions that were introduced in the last years. So it's a low-hanging fruit, and this is something that would be somehow resolved, or somehow progress could be achieved in this area. And I think there was a hint in the, results of the discussions between the ministers of foreign affairs that this would be one of the areas to go forward. And maybe more generally, I think it would be helpful to have something, Andrey was already speaking about the analogies between Gorbachev and Reagan. I would find another analogy, maybe to have something like a broad discussion like it was at Reykjavik, where it was just a broad discussion of the issues, and maybe not so much structured discussion, but to have, and not, as it was said, to focus so much on the concrete deliverables, but to speak more broadly about, where we are and where we want to go. And this philosophical discussion may be also helpful between the two leaders to going forward.
Well, excellent. Well, hopefully we've had a little bit of that philosophical discussion today. I know over the course of this past semester, we've had a great set of conversations with our colleagues at MGIMO. And so I'd like to thank everyone who's participated in them, and also our four panelists today for continuing and capping off a semester's worth of discussion and debate. Professor Suchkov, do you have any final remarks? Or if not, we can cap off the semester and then hopefully pick this up again when we reconvene this fall.
No, thank you very much. I know I wasn't asked this question of one recommendation to both presidents, but if I had to make one, I would say try to keep politics out of policies as much as possible, because obviously we're in a state of situation where both in an unhealthy situation, actually, where Russia is no longer just a foreign policy issue, it's a domestic factor. And the same is true about the United States trying to be domestically exploited rather than being looked upon as a foreign policy issues. But other than that, I want to thank all the participants and all the panelists, and also our colleagues at the Fletcher School and my colleague, Professor Miller, for tremendous cooperation and help to me personally and our students. And many thanks for this course, and we'll look forward to this course and future cooperation in the coming academic year, hopefully in offline mode.
Indeed, I think we all agree on that point.
All right.
So thanks everyone, and we look forward to picking this up in the fall. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.